Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, of course. Thanks for having me.
If it's okay for me to start with an introduction, despite my weird camera situation right now, I am pleased to welcome Jasmine to our Tuesday Tea with Touchstone. Jasmine is a passionate supporter um, of marginalized communities. We train together in the BIPOC sphere. She's a strong supporter of LGBTQI plus spaces for people with disabilities and perinatal trauma. She worked in community mental health settings and residential treatment before moving into full time private practice in 2018. She is an LCSW, perinatal mental health specialist, an EMDR approved consultant, and a clinical supervisor. And I am just proud to know her and facilitate with her in so many of the EMDR spaces. So, Jasmine, thank you for being with us today and for talking about complex trauma with us and how we can really customize that to our EMDR communities.
Thank you so much for having me. So, welcome. And I'm excited to be here to share about, some tips and spill the tea about complex trauma and EMDR. I really encourage you to take care of yourself as we maneuver this. And we're going to emphasize that because it can be, triggering at times because this is, as it states, complex trauma. And we're going to take a deeper dive into each of the phases and how, through my personal experience working with clients and also with my own journey of healing with my complex PTSD, and just tips and things to keep in mind as you're supporting your clients. So first off, with the next slide, I would like to do a land acknowledgement of the Tongva and Hashiman nations who lived and continue to live here in Long Beach, California. And this is, a call to action to do your work, to know who has resided here, who continues to reside here. And there's a link on here to find the land acknowledgement where you reside, and to, get to know the history, the true history. Thank you to those who have been here before us, our ancestors. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about complex trauma, and touching over, some pieces of it. And so, again, potential triggers. Um, so I want you to take care of yourself. In your space, if you can identify maybe an object or something that is very grounding and soothing, so maybe it's something you can see in your vision, like a picture or something that's like very soothing to you. Maybe something that you can touch, like a grounding rock, or if you have something like, soft to touch, maybe a smell. So if you have any type of oils or lotions, any taste, if you have something to drink like tea or coffee or water, whatever is pleasurable for you. And just kind of, take note of that item. So if you're feeling there's a trigger happening or you need a little grounding, it can be helpful to reach out and lean into those. And then before we formally begin, we're just going to take a collective breath together. However deep works for you, whatever is manageable for your system. And so just going to welcome everybody to take a deep breath in and out. Let's do one more deep breath in and out. Thank you for joining me with that. And so now we're ready to jump into what is complex trauma. All right. So complex trauma, my hope and thought is that, you know, those who are interested in this topic have experience already with, you know, what PTSD is, what complex trauma is. But I really want to just emphasize what, you know, kind of distinguishes it between, you know, somebody who's been through a lot versus somebody who has complex PTSD, right? Just like with traumas, traumatic events, they don't all grow into full blown PTSD. And same with, you know, those who've been through a lot, it doesn't necessarily mean that it goes into full blown complex PTSD. When we're talking about complex trauma and PTSD, we're talking about a pervasive developmental, you know, challenges, struggles, and where there's been, you know, a betrayal at some degree, whether it's from primary caregivers, whether it's been somebody within their system, a family. We're also talking about bigger systems of oppression, of consistent oppression, whether it's specific narratives, whether it's lack of representation, whether it's, you know, distorted representation or misrepresentation. And all of this starts impacting a person's, you know, self worth, self value, self esteem. Also, we might see, you know, challenges with, you know, affect regulation, being able to regulate their emotions, right? Many times, those who've experienced this have had to turn off their alarm systems in order to survive. They've had to disconnect from the body system. They've had to disconnect from the emotions, right? And so when we're talking about doing this deeper work with EMDR, we're talking about we have to give them time to start to get used to listening to these systems again. And it can be a lot at first, and it can be having to be able to notice. I always call EMDR the art of noticing. And this is where that art begins, developing just understanding and being able to understand the self and what's happening for the self. And so I just wanted to emphasize the difference of the complex PTSD and how it complements the EMDR work. Because as we know, what we're trying to do is to, you know, identify memories that have this charge, this emotional charge, this physical, this like when we go to it, it's like it almost feels like it's happening again, right? That's a sign that it's in that amygdala, and we're utilizing EMDR therapy reprocessing to be able to get it connected to that prefrontal where it gets that timestamp, right? And so that's what we're trying to do by shifting and decreasing those negative messages about self and increasing the positive messages about self, right? Those positive cognitions. And so, for that foundation of what complex trauma is, this is a really powerful therapy that can really help those be able to shift how they view themselves, as they maneuver the world with interpersonal relationships, with how they are able to function in different areas, and how they're able to recognize and learn how to regulate those emotions. So, we're going to begin with phase one, right? And so, I want to emphasize that, you know, different training institutes might have different, you know, variations. And so I train with the Institute of Creative Mindfulness. I'm a facilitator. And so I go by the curriculum that we utilize. And so there might be little different nuances with the training that you have if you're trained elsewhere. But the foundation should be similar, right? And so for phase one, it's target selection, right? This is where we identify the negative cognitions, the memories, the touchstone root memories that get us to where the seed got planted, right? And so at ICM, we do thematic targeting, where we identify the first time a person's believed this about themselves, the worst, and then the recent, right? And these are asking them to go into their memory bank and access these memories. Now, if we think about, complex trauma and how this memory bank could be overwhelmed with multiple memories, right? And for that in itself, we need to be cautious and need to make sure we have done some solid work with our clients before we start narrowing in on the negative cognition and the memories, right? And so I kind of view phase one as almost like two parts in my brain. This is how I conceptualize. And the first part is, the assessment, like getting to know your clients, right? And everybody has different ways of assessing. And, some do more like life timeline, a genogram, like whatever tools you utilize, just always come from that trauma informed mindset that because there's so much, it can be one, very flooding. And also, two, there can be like lots of, suppressed memories, right? I call it Swiss cheese memory, where there's like holes missing. So it can be very challenging to do it timeline style and can, in fact, be very triggering for a client because it just only highlights, the gaps and highlights, what they're missing, right? And so we want to do this with a very client-centered approach of, how the clients would like us to get to know them better, right? And so that's the first part. And then with targeting, and I kind of interweave phase one and phase two, but with targeting, I have learned through my work that it's at least how I work with clients, right? Is I only do one negative cognition at a time, right? Because each negative cognition is like a whole like memory network. And so if we're doing multiple negative cognitions in a sitting, it can be very overwhelming. And also because sometimes, a memory has multiple negative cognitions, right? Or, the negative cognitions start to get a little bit blurred because remember, the memory like crispness is not always there, that it starts to almost be a representation of how their memory is like intertwined and interwoven. And it's not like, okay, clear, like, okay, this is a negative cognition. These are the memories, this one, this one. It's all intertwined. And so I quickly learned that that can be overwhelming for the client and not knowing exactly like where do we start, right? And so I quickly shifted to, okay, let's just do one negative cognition at a time. And then, as we talk about phase eight later, there's a lot that can shift. Also with the memories, new memories can come to the surface, new NCs can come to the surface. And so I was finding that I was having to reshuffle and reorganize things anyway. So why expose your client to excess targeting if you don't need to, right? We always want to come from, a gentle trauma informed approach. And these are some of the things that I have learned as I work with my clients to help, take it one slice by slice, right? Also, because of complex trauma and the roots oftentimes are associated with, very ruptured attachment foundation, it's crucial that you give time to build that rapport with the therapist, right? And so we don't want to, rush into it because that can be really overwhelming for their system. And so you need to take your time to get to know them so that they can be prepared to do this deeper work with you and can know that you're able to be there to hold space for wherever their brain takes them, right? So those are some tips about phase one. And again, the emphasis is I don't rush into targeting, right? That might be a couple of sessions down the road, and it all depends on how phase two is going. And so we're going to talk about phase two, and feel free to drop questions in the chat. And at the end, there'll be time for questions. So phase two, so I call this like, emotional muscle, which is why I have this cute little picture of the brain lifting the weights, right? And so if you have a client, and many times when we're talking about complex PTSD, complex trauma, that, clients have not been able to develop this muscle. In fact, they weren't allowed to, right? If we talk about oppression, not allowed to have a voice, not allowed to be seen. And so you need to give them some time to build this muscle, right? I talk about like reprocessing phases 3 through 7. That's like lifting like a 300-pound weight, right? And if you've never lifted weights before, you've never like been allowed to even enter the building to lift weights, we have some steps to do in order to get them prepared, right? And it's building that emotional muscle. And as we talked about at the beginning, one of the pieces associated with complex PTSD is this difficulty with affect regulation, right? Being able to notice those signs of, oh, it's getting into that high level, right? So part of our work in phase two is helping them to start to notice, right? To be able to self monitor, to understand what it looks like when they're in that window of tolerance, what it looks like when they're starting to shift out of that window of tolerance, right? And I do a lot of feeling thermometer work in my phase two, because again, this might be some of the first time that somebody's been asked, how are you doing? What's happening for you? What's going on in your body, right? We know that many times there's had to be body numbing because there's been trauma being inflicted on the body, right? And so again, this is not always an easy part. Like I think sometimes we think, oh, like phase two, preparation, resourcing, coping skills, like this is the easy, like this is the good part, right? And it is. And also it can bring in a lot of grief because it's them recognizing, hey, nobody's asked me like, what am I feeling? What's happening for me? What do I need to take care of myself? Right. And so I do see, a higher, kind of challenge with having to manage the grief component of recognizing, like, wow, like I haven't been asked, like, what are my coping skills? What can I do to take care of myself? In fact, maybe I've gotten completely different messaging, right? And so that's all about building that emotional muscle, right? And so in, preparation, we need a way to contain. And I know, we do the container meditation, but for some, they are going to need some modifications to that, right? I do find that we'll need a higher level of like, flexibility of being able to help our clients with like, how do we modify this container so it works for you? Oftentimes they'll say like, there's so much, like it feels like overwhelming to just notice all of that. It's like, okay, so maybe we can use like a shrink kind of like wrap where, like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids movie. I know I might be dating myself, but that was something that was popular when I was growing up. And so that's where, that the shrinking gun was used to shrink things so that it can be more manageable and you can put it in the container. or have them like, imagine like writing it down and folding it up and putting in their container. A way to kind of condense it, because again, when we're talking about, there might be lots to put in that container. So you just have to have ways to like modify it and be prepared to support them, and also be okay and be able to validate if there's grief components that arise during this process as well. And so our ultimate goal in preparation is to help them get to being in getting back to a place of okay, right? I try to steer clear of like, safety, like, because again, I don't know what that means for them, what that can trigger, but it's like, what have you been doing to help you get back to a place of okay, right? Some adaptive, some maybe maladaptive, right? And talking about the differences, and then adding to the list of like things that they can do to get back to the place of okay, get back in that window of tolerance. And that's what we're doing in phase 2, is helping them recognize that they have tools, resources to help them get back into that place of okay. Even if it's that they're still high, right? Because when I'm talking about that feeling thermometer, I go over like, window of tolerance is 0 to 6, 7 to 10. It's called, what I call it's a danger zone, right? And so if we're talking about where, I obviously virtual, um, and when we're talking about 7 to 8, that's when, if you're doing like, a virtual session, that the internet's starting to glitch, right? And so that amygdala can kind of see the prefrontal information, but the information is starting to get a little bit harder to like reach and harder to lean into. And then when you get to the 9, 10 of the thermometer, that's when the internet's out. Prefrontal is disconnected, that neural fiber bridge is up, and then it's straight amygdala response, right? And so I provide the psychoeducation so they understand what's happening for them. And I normalize it, because many times there's a message of, what's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? Right. And so providing that psychoeducation can be very supportive and helpful for them to understand, like, oh, okay, so it's not just me that can reach that danger zone. Right. And I'll say, me, your therapist sitting right in front of you talking about it. If I get out of my, window of tolerance in my danger zone, my prefrontal is going to go offline. Right. So anybody is at risk for this. Right. And so that one normalizes it, validates it, and helps them be able to understand that there are things that they can do on a daily basis. Right. So I emphasize that preventative, proactive mindset of mental health. Just like we take care of our physical health every day, right? We drink, we eat, we sleep, go to the bathroom, right? We do several things throughout the day to take care of our physical body, right? And we also have to do the same with our mental health. And so that's part of what we're emphasizing in phase 2, so that when we get into reprocessing phases 3 through 7, they've already have a system going for them that they can lean into as things start coming up, because it will. And so we want to make sure that they have those tools. All right, phases 3 through 7, which, as you can see by this picture, can be a very windy road, right? It's not straight linear necessarily, and it's very unique to each client. And I think, I can speak to, by being in a training as an EMDR therapist and observing and facilitating, um, we get a privileged, like, kind of perspective of practicing with colleagues who have had, at some degree, exposure to mental health, for the very fact that they are therapists, right? And, also maybe have been doing their own work. And so I think it also gives this kind of thought, like, ooh, we can like get through this memory like super, super quick, which is definitely possible. But then there's also times when it's like, slower moving, chipping away because there's just so much to unpack. And this particularly I've noticed with clients who have complex PTSD, because if we think about that file cabinet analogy, we're pulling out that file cabinet, we're, picking out that negative cognition folder. And in that negative cognition folder, there's lots of like, pieces of paper, and each paper represents a memory. Right. And so if you have lots of memories associated with that NC, that folder is going to be a lot thicker than somebody who has less memories in there. And so know that that could take the mind, the brain, time to shuffle through. Right. And then also, I think about it like overstuffed folder where there's papers that are like jammed, and like you open up the file cabinet and like papers kind of pop out, and the memories start to kind of cross over. So there's a lot of like, layers that are having the brain's having to work through going through this. Right. So in our institute, we talk about beginning with a flight plan before we enter into phase 3. So it's basically this kind of visualization of getting ready for takeoff, right? And so the flight plan is where we go over the, safety pieces of identifying, and I do virtual sessions. And so we work together in our phase 2 of identifying items in their space that they can lean into if they need to pause, or if they need to be able to take care of themselves during or after. And so we go over those lists. Usually it includes something to drink, right? Water, tea, coffee, sometimes having something of a different temperature, like having like a frozen water bottle like next to them, or having like a warmer like cup if that's soothing, right? If we need to have grounding, sometimes like having a temperature shift can be a way to get them back in the present moment. An item that is like soothing and of comfort. Maybe it's something, tactile that they can touch, or something that they can look at, just like we walked through at the beginning. Also tissues. That was something I learned because, when prior in the office, I had them available, but, I'm not there to, have it available. And I know there's like, conversations about tissues, like, handing them and all of that. And so just have it in their space, whatever they feel comfortable. Um, and, going over that, pause sign. I do verbal, nonverbal pause sign. And I always say, every single time, doesn't matter if it's the first reprocessing or the 15th reprocessing, I always say you're always in control, right? And, if you need to use that pause sign, we'll do whatever we can to help to support you. And so then flight plan is done. Then we move into phase 3, which is, kind of opening up all the channels, right? I think about the pilot who's shifting on all those buttons and turning them on. And we're shifting on the channels of the image, right? That's what the question asks. What part of the image? What is the worst part of the image, right? The thought, the negative cognitions, the positive cognitions. And oftentimes, because the traumas are so pervasive, I will have flushed out the positive cognition the session before. Because if you wait for like reprocessing session and to do it like in the moment, sometimes those positive cognition can seem so unattainable, so like almost like a foreign language because they haven't been exposed to it, that it can take like 15 minutes, 20 minutes to flush out. And if you do the 15-minute therapy hour like I do, then we're starting to really shrink the reprocessing time. And so I found it to be helpful to have those items already identified. And so instead of asking an open ended question of what is the positive cognition that goes with this memory? What is the negative cognition? I ask a verification question. Because again, if we think about some of these memories can be tied to multiple negative cognitions, right? And so if we ask a more open-ended way, then all of a sudden these negative cognitions and these memory networks are being like lit up and starting to get paid attention to. And now we could start getting flooded, right? And so I learned pretty quickly during the work of doing more of a verification so that we can just focus on which file cabinet, which folder, which memory, so that we don't just say, okay, let's just, look at all these file cabinets. And then now all of a sudden they all feel like they're starting to open up, right? And so that's something that I have learned through my experience that can be a helpful tip. Um, So, phase four, desensitization, as I mentioned, can be a lot to unpack. And so, there might be higher chances of needing to use potentially interweaves, right? We don't want to jump the gun. We still want to wait to make sure that there's a stuck moment, but there could be a potential to have that because, again, there are these protective parts that might be coming in and trying to say, like, don't listen to that body. Don't listen to those cues, right? And so there might be higher need to be able to lean into those, right? And then also there's higher levels of potential dissociation. And so in our phase two work, we're going to need to get to know the client's system, get to know their dissociative profile, get to know their parts, right? And this is a delicate dance and a delicate conversation with your clients. And so, doing that pre work of them getting to know their system and you getting to know their system will help you better support them in the reprocessing as to what might be coming up, right? I've seen some just beautiful reprocessings where parts come in as a supports. And it just, every time I am privileged to witness, it just gives me goosebumps of, younger parts being able to be supported by present parts or whatever name works for them, right? There could be potential blocking beliefs that might come up to awareness that maybe they didn't have awareness before. And so you might need to be able to pivot, not during the reprocessing, right? Like once we're, getting ready for takeoff, we're not going to do a big shift in that moment, but maybe in phase 8 when we're reevaluating, we might need to do a pivot if a blocking belief comes up or a feeder memory, like a memory that's saying up, we can't fully move this until we address this other piece, right? And so there's higher levels of that. And so being able to know how to be flexible and yet also how to know which parts of the phases to, stick to, because there's intentionality about the phases. There's intentionality about even the questions in phase 3, right? There's intentionality of why we stay out of the way during reprocessing because we want the brain to heal itself, which is to me the most amazing thing about EMDR. It's literally their brain healing how it needs to be healed for them. And I know just with my experience, what I've been able to witness, there's no way, one, that I could be as creative as that person's brain. And two, it's going to feel very different if I were to give that, reframe that, idea than actually their brain being able to shift it and truly believe it. And then the final thing about when we're talking about the phases is that ecological reality that is, held with that ecological zero, right? We want to flush that out and talk about what that means before we get into reprocessing, because sometimes there's this kind of understanding of, that zero means there's no like feeling about it. Like it's like, oh, it's all good. No, when we're talking about, significant life events that, have happened over and over again, right? Or, significant betrayals, these are always going to hold an ecological reality that it's always going to be a crappy thing that you had to go through. And that's an understatement of some of the things that, people have had to endure, right? And so when we're talking about that ecological reality, it's about not that this thing is, horrible that you had to go through. It's that it is connected to that prefrontal. It gets that timestamp, right? Because that's a big difference between it being stored in that amygdala where there's no sense of time, and then that prefrontal where there's orientation to time, right? And that time stamper, and the brain has different ways to show that, right? And then also that it's not tied to that negative belief about self. It's now being able to be connected to a positive belief about self, right? And sometimes you'll start hearing even like, past tense language or the image. It's very clear that there's like, some space between them and the memory, right? So that's what we're striving for in that ecological zero. And so that's what we really need to emphasize as we're like, getting them comfortable so they realize we're not trying to, you know, discount or take away what you've been through, because that is, part of your journey and we would never want to do that. And it's not to say it's okay or any of that. It's that for you, it is no longer carrying the same weight in your system, right? So it can be very helpful to flush that out. And that's also partially when I'm doing thermometer work, that conversation happens and they get to understand more of what that, feels like, what that looks like, so that it come reprocessing, it's not the first time that they experience it. Um, if you're noticing that they're getting stuck in like a certain score, sometimes it can be helpful when they, ask, or when you ask what keeps it at that score, to have a way to contain. Because a lot of times it's like, well, there's other memories in there that have this same NC or that are, similar, right? Because oftentimes there's multiple events similar. So we're going to have to lean into their containment strategy and say, by containing those other memories or the future worry of what it's going to look like, does that change your score at all? And many times I've experienced it does. They'll be like, oh, if I'm talking about just that one memory, then yeah, it's shifted. Right. So being prepared to understand that sometimes with complex PTSD, because there's so many memories in there, you have to be able to help them to recognize we can only shift one memory at a time. So phase 8. So phase 8 is, for me, like an important phase that I think sometimes can get rushed through, especially like sometimes how it looks as like, okay, let's check the scores and then let's decide based off the scores what we do next, right? Which is part of phase 8. But what I hold phase 8 as is a time to notice the shifts that are presently happening, right? Because this is not easy work. This is about them going through all the icky tunnel of information and trying to get to the other side, right? And so, in order for them to be motivated to keep going back in that icky tunnel for each memory, we got to help them connect to the present shifts, right? And so, spending time getting to see like, okay, did you have any present times where that trigger came up for you? And how did you respond? And what did you do? And sometimes clients have this kind of thought of like, well, I still got hurt when that person, like, said this or when this happened. And I say, well, of course, right? We're not trying to make you into a robot where if somebody hurts you, you're not going to feel it. Somebody does something to you, it's not going to impact you. We're trying to help you be able to, withstand and hold all the emotions, right? It's where it takes you to, were you able to stay in that window of tolerance? Were you able to lean into those adaptive resources, right? And if so, then great. That's you being able to regulate, the emotions, right? And so I think, again, because, maybe prior there had been some negative feedback about their, emotional reactivity, that, negative emotions are, all of a sudden like pathologized and bad and like, let's get rid of that. No, it's quite the opposite. It's let's notice, let's nurture, let's soothe for that emotion, right? Sometimes that's part of their system. That's like telling them, like, hey, this part needs some attention. And we don't ever want to encourage, shove it out, ignore it, push it to the side. We want to say, like, okay, how can we bring closer and nurture? What can we do for that part? What can we do for that, emotion that's happening for you? Right. And being able to like really kind of notice those shifts. Sometimes it's like, okay, so if you would have come into that trigger prior to starting our work, how would you have responded differently? And then maybe it's like, oh, well, if that would have happened, I would have been like upset for days, maybe even for a week or so. It would have totally wiped me out. Right. And so, how long did it impact you now? Still impacted me for a good like half a day or a day. I felt like, just out of it. But, I remembered our tools, what we were leaning into. And so I'll say, okay, prefrontal's coming in, right? You remember to be able to lean into those adaptive coping skills, right? And I'll say that whenever I'm hearing that prefrontal coming in, I'll kind of point to that forehead so they kind of see me do it over and over. And then eventually they'll say, like, Jasmine, I saw and I heard, I felt that prefrontal coming in. I saw you pointing to your forehead. Like, great, awesome. Right. So this phase 8 is really important because sometimes there's so much in that file cabinet that it feels like overwhelming and big. And so we got to make sure that we take notice of the wins, however small, however big they are. And that's what I conceptualize as phase 8 being. Right. And then it can roll into maybe some future template, depending upon where you're at, and then also maybe going to do some other memories. Now, I do say, like, there's obviously kind of, I think, a mixture of like a discussion of, do you clear out all the memories of the NC and then, go into future template, or can you do it sooner? Right. And it really depends case by case on the client and how much anchoring do they have to that positive cognition. If this is the first time they've ever believed it about themselves, and you know that there's a lot more charged memories in there, it might be too hot to do a future template. It might make it that much harder for them to like start to feel anchored and connected to it. Right. Um, However, if this is maybe a positive cognition that maybe more recent life experiences have given them ability to believe, you might be able to do it sooner, right? So this is where that, just that clinical judgment and you getting to know the client, you really knowing their system and doing your due diligence to get to know like how you best can support them. And I always give my clients choices and options, right? Whenever I can, I want to empower them on their healing journey because it's their journey. And I'm providing a space to support, to give information, but it's really up to them what what works for them because they're going to know their system the best. Right. So, any questions that might be coming up? And if you need to lean into those resources that we talked about at the beginning, taking some breaths. Okay. So I'm seeing I just did phase 3 reprocessing with a client with complex PTSD. After lots of prep in phase 2, she struggled to get more than just the initial image that we started with, but was able to notice more emotion coming up. I normalized this, saying it takes time, but she layered on the worried that nothing can help me. Is this yeah. So this could be a potential blocking belief that might be coming up potentially. And so yeah, like there's a lot of, like, maybe even kind of surprise, like emotions, intensity, memories that can be coming up for the client. And so, good job normalizing. And then also, just kind of noticing what's happening. And so if you notice, and again, because reprocessing continues after the session, and so, check back in because maybe the brain had the ability to work through it. And maybe, they ended the session, like, they started at a 10, maybe they went to an 8, and then maybe the next time they're at a 7, right? But they're still like chipping away and getting closer and closer to being in that window of tolerance. And seeing if the brain can work through that, nothing can help me. But if it keeps coming up, it might be one of those moments where we have to pivot, not during reprocessing, but maybe say, okay, so I've noticed that maybe this nothing can help me piece comes up for you. Maybe we should look at the roots and target for that. And so pivot for that, and then come back to the other one that you started after you did some work to basically decrease that negative narrative. So yes, this can happen. Thank you for the question. Any other questions? And so just know that this is just touching the surface of, like, what all the layers can mean. And this is where, talking to consultants who have experience with complex PTSD, because there's so much, like I mentioned very quickly, about dissociation and parts work. And each of those alone is like a bigger discussion and having unique pieces of how to help support our clients. And there are higher levels of that when we are talking about complex PTSD. And so, finding a consultant who can support you, right? Doing your work. But I'm always coming from the client as the experts, right? And I tell them, from the beginning, you know yourself the best. I'm here to, be curious with you, be curious to know your system, be curious to know, all the things. And so, can we be curious together and, doing the dance together?
Wow, Jasmine, thank you so much for all of your knowledge. I love, facilitating with you so much throughout the year, because I get to hear this lens of complex trauma. And I really appreciate you and all of the value that you bring to us on the Touchstone team. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And, thank you all who support your clients, because it's very much needed. So, thank you. I think there's the website if you want to email me with, questions or anything. And then I think on this last slide, I have a couple different consultation groups. So as Taina mentioned, we have BIPOC EMDR foundational training cohorts that we help get trained. Love the space with Lisa Hayes. She's amazing. And Taina and Erica. Our team is awesome. And so I wanted to have a continued space. So there's two groups, first and third Thursday of the month for the BIPOC clinicians. And then being that I work with a variety of different marginalized groups, I wanted to have a group that can kind of encompass. And so I have a specific anti-oppression EMDR consultation. And again, as mentioned earlier, this can include a lot of clients with complex PTSD because of the, consistent betrayal. And then I have a general group because I do have the privilege to train with a variety of different trainers, and Mara being one of them. Who thank you, Mara, for having me here, and her Touchstone team. And feel free to reach out.